He said it the way you'd say the weather had turned, calm, matter of fact, like he'd already decided and was only informing me as a courtesy. Mom, the house needs to go on the market. We've already talked to an agent. I was standing at my own kitchen counter, the one I'd picked out 31 years ago from a catalog with my late husband Gerald, the one with the small chip near the sink from the time my son was 7 and dropped a cast iron pan he wasn't supposed to be carrying. I was holding a mug of tea that had gone cold because my daughter-in-law had been talking at me for 40 minutes before my son walked in and finished what she'd started. I didn't say anything. I set the mug down very carefully, the way you do when your hands are shaking and you don't want anyone to see. My name is Dorothy. I'm 68 years old. I taught elementary school in Oakville, Ontario for 34 years, and I raised one son in this house, mostly alone after Gerald got sick, and then after Gerald was gone. The house is a 4-bedroom brick semi on a quiet street with a silver maple in the front yard that my husband planted the year our son was born. Its roots have lifted part of the front walk, and I have never once considered having it cut down. My son's name is Nathan. He is 41 years old. He is an engineer. He was, for most of his life, a decent and considerate person. His wife's name is Simone. She came into his life 4 years ago, and I want to be careful here because this is not a story about hating a daughter-in-law. I did not hate Simone. I tried, genuinely and for a long time, to love her. What I could not do, what I eventually stopped pretending to do, was trust her. They had moved in 8 months earlier. That was my idea. I want to be clear about that. Nathan had called me on a Sunday evening and told me that he and Simone had run into some financial difficulty. He used that phrase, financial difficulty, in the same voice he used when he was a teenager and needed to tell me something he didn't want to explain fully. I didn't push. I said, of course, come stay with me. We'll figure it out together. I made up the guest room. I bought extra groceries. I moved Gerald's old workshop things into the garage to give them more space. What I didn't know at the time, what I didn't find out until months later, was that Simone had been carrying nearly $240,000 in personal debt, credit lines, a failed business she'd started before she met Nathan, a civil judgment from a former business partner that had gone to collections. Nathan knew. He had known for some time. And he had decided that selling my house was the solution. I found out about the debt the same week the real estate agent came to the door. I had not been told an agent was coming. I had not been asked if I wanted one. I came downstairs on a Tuesday morning in my housecoat to find a woman in a blazer standing in my front hallway with a clipboard, already measuring the sight line from the door to the staircase. Simone was beside her, nodding at things the woman was saying, her arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone reviewing a property she had already mentally purchased. "What's happening?" I said. Simone turned and smiled at me. "We're just getting a feel for what it could list at." "Nathan talked to you about this." "Nathan said you might need to make a change," I said. "He didn't say anything about this." The woman with the clipboard looked between us. She had the careful smile of someone who understood she had walked into something she hadn't been briefed on. I asked her to leave, politely. I held the door and I thanked her for her time and I closed it behind her, and then I turned around and I looked at my daughter-in-law standing in my hallway and I said, "This is my house, Simone." She said, "It's Nathan's family home." There's a difference between those two things. A profound difference, but I could see from her face that she did not recognize it or did not care to. That night, Nathan came home from work and we sat at the kitchen table and he laid it out for me like a business proposal. He was kind about it, or he was trying to be. He said the house was worth a lot. He'd looked it up, comparable sales in the neighborhood, and he was right. It had gone up considerably, and that if we sold it, the proceeds could clear Simone's debt entirely and still leave enough for me to buy a condo. Something smaller, something more manageable, he said, for someone my age. I asked him what he meant by my age. He looked at the table. I asked him whose idea this was. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "It makes financial sense, Mom." That was when I understood. It was not that he'd stopped loving me. I don't believe that, even now. It was that love had been moved aside, quietly and without announcement, to make room for something more urgent. Simone's debt was real. The pressure she was under was real. And Nathan, who had always needed to fix things, had found what looked to him like a solution. He had just never stopped to ask whether the solution belonged to him. I did not cry that night. I went to bed and I lay in the dark and I thought about Gerald, about what he would have said, about the way he used to sit at that same kitchen table with his hands around a coffee mug and say, "Dorothy, the answer is always simpler than it looks. You just have to find the quiet spot in the middle of the noise." I found the quiet spot and I started making phone calls. The first call was to my friend Margaret, who had been my closest friend since we both taught at the same school in the early 90s, who had also lost her husband, who knew what it meant to be a woman of a certain age with a house and a son, who had forgotten what the word yours actually means. The second call was to my lawyer. His name is Robert Chin, and he had been Gerald's lawyer and then mine for 20 years. And when I told him what was happening, he went very quiet and then he said, "Dorothy, I'm glad you called." The third call was to my financial advisor at my credit union, a woman named Patricia, who I'd been meeting with every January for 15 years, who also went quiet when I explained and then said, "When can you come in?" I had those 3 meetings within a week. I did not tell Nathan or Simone. I drove myself to each of them and I sat in offices and I listened carefully and I took notes on a yellow legal pad, the old-fashioned way, because writing things down by hand helps me think. What I learned in those meetings was something I should have done years earlier. Robert walked me through the process of placing the house in a family trust. In Ontario, you can do this. There are specific rules and there are tax implications and there is paperwork, quite a lot of paperwork, but it can be done. The effect was that the house would no longer be legally mine alone. It would be held in trust, with conditions I defined, and nothing about it could be decided without my explicit written consent. It could not be listed. It could not be sold, not without me. Robert also explained something else. Because Nathan and Simone were living in my home and because I had no formal rental agreement with them, I had more legal standing than I'd been made to feel. My home was not their home. Their presence there was at my invitation. That invitation could be withdrawn. Patricia looked over my finances and reminded me that I had always been careful, that I had a pension, that I had RRSPs, that I had Gerald's life insurance invested sensibly, and that if I ever did choose to sell this house, I would be fine. I did not need to be rescued. I was not the one in financial trouble. I went home that evening and I made soup from scratch, from the chicken carcass I'd been keeping in the freezer the way my mother taught me, and I set the table for 3, and I called them down to dinner. Simone picked at her bowl. Nathan talked about a project at work. I listened and I asked questions and I was present, and I did not say a word about what I'd spent the last week doing. I want to explain something about that silence because I know how it sounds. People hear she didn't say anything and they think weakness. They think fear. Or they think the person is being sneaky, strategic, cold. It wasn't any of those things. It was something harder to name. I was 68 years old and this was my son at my table, and I was still hoping, even then, even knowing what I knew, that he would come to me, that he would sit down and look at me and say, "Mom, I'm sorry. I don't know how this got so far." He didn't. The weeks that followed were some of the strangest I have ever lived through, and I have lived through some hard ones. Simone began treating the house differently. I don't know if she thought the decision had already been made or if she simply felt entitled in a way she hadn't bothered to hide before. She rearranged things in the kitchen. She moved a photograph of Gerald and me from the hall table and put it in what she called the storage area, which was a box in the hall closet. When I took it out and put it back, she moved it again. I stopped putting it back. She started having contractors come in to, quote, on renovations. One morning, I came downstairs to find a man I'd never met walking through my living room with a measuring tape. He said Simone had asked him to look at the main floor. I thanked him for his time and showed him the door. That evening, she said to me, "Dorothy, you can't keep undermining the process." I said, "What process, Simone?" She looked at me the way people look at someone they've decided is no longer a real participant in the conversation. Nathan said, "Mom, we're just trying to get our ducks in a row." I remember thinking, these are my ducks, every single one. The phone call from the real estate agent, a different agent this time, came on a Wednesday afternoon. She said she'd been asked to prepare a market evaluation and wanted to schedule a walkthrough. I told her there must be some misunderstanding. The property was not available for evaluation. She seemed confused but professional, and we ended the call pleasantly. I hung up and I sat in Gerald's armchair in the living room, and I looked at the silver maple through the front window, the one that had grown so large its branches touched the eaves, and I made a decision. Not an angry decision, not a bitter one, a quiet one, the kind that feels less like a choice and more like finally acknowledging something you already knew. I called Margaret. I asked her if the offer still stood. She said, "Dorothy, your room has been ready for 6 months. Margaret lives in Guelph, about 45 minutes away. She has a house with a spare room on the main floor and a garden twice the size of mine, and a dog named Biscuit who is deeply indifferent to strangers in the best possible way." She and her husband had talked for years about that spare room, that it was always there if I needed it, and after he passed too, she had said it again, more seriously. I packed on a Thursday. I did not pack dramatically. I took what I needed: clothes, my good winter coat, my medication, Gerald's photograph, the yellow legal pad, a box of things that were mine and only mine. I packed the way you pack when you are not afraid, carefully, thoughtfully, without hurry. I did not pack everything because I was not leaving my house. I was simply not sleeping in it for a while. I left a note on the kitchen table. It said, "Nathan, I've gone to stay with Margaret in Guelph for a time. The house is fine. Robert Chen is handling some legal paperwork. He'll be in touch this week. I love you, Mom." I drove myself to Guelph on a Friday morning. It was October, and the drive was beautiful, the way Ontario gets in October. All amber and rust along the highway, the sky that particular shade of blue that only happens in the fall. I had CBC radio on low. I stopped at a Tim Hortons outside of Milton and had a coffee and sat in the parking lot for 15 minutes just breathing. Biscuit was delighted to see me, which helped more than I expected. Robert sent the letter on Monday morning, as we had discussed. It was a formal legal notice explaining that the property at my address was now held in a registered family trust under my name as sole trustee. It outlined that any attempts to list, sell, evaluate, mortgage, or otherwise transfer the property without the written consent of the trustee constituted a legal violation, and that any such attempts would be pursued accordingly. It also noted, clearly and without drama, that the current occupants of the property had no tenancy agreement and that continued residence was subject to the trustee's discretion. Robert told me afterward that Nathan had called him within 2 hours of receiving it. He said Nathan was upset. He said Nathan had asked if there was any way around it, and Robert had explained patiently and professionally that there was not. I imagine that was a hard afternoon for my son. I say that without satisfaction, genuinely. I sat in Margaret's garden that Monday afternoon with a cup of tea and biscuit at my feet and the last of the autumn sun on my face, and I thought about Nathan at 7 years old, dropping that cast iron pan and looking up at me with huge eyes waiting to be in trouble. And I had picked up the pan and said, "Well, that one's between you and the pan, kiddo." And he had laughed, that open, full laugh of a little boy who hasn't yet learned to hide what he feels. I missed that boy. I still do. Nathan drove to Guelph to see me 3 weeks later. He called first and asked if he could come. I said yes. He sat across from me at Margaret's kitchen table, and he looked tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. He looked like someone who had been in a place he didn't recognize and was only now finding his way out. He told me that Simone was working with a debt consolidation advisor, that she had found a credit counseling service through her employer's benefits program, which I had not known was available to her, and which I suspected she had not pursued seriously until there was no other option. He told me he was sorry. He said it plainly, without preamble, the way I had raised him to apologize, without wrapping it in excuses or qualifications. He said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I got lost for a while, and I didn't protect you." I told him that I had never needed him to protect me. That was never what I wanted from him. What I wanted was for him to remember whose house he was standing in, whose whole life was threaded through those walls. What it meant to be asked, by your own son, to disappear. He cried. I hadn't seen him cry since his father's funeral. We talked for 2 hours about Simone's debt and how it had happened, the slow accumulation of it that she hadn't told him about until they were in deep, about the pressure he'd felt, the particular desperation of watching the person you love drown and looking around for anything to throw, about how somewhere in the fog of that, he had stopped thinking of me as a person with a life of my own and started thinking of me as, I am using his word, a resource. It is a terrible thing to hear from your child. I will tell you that honestly, not because it was cruel exactly, but because it was so small. After everything, after all the years, to be reduced to a resource. But I sat and I listened and I let him say it because it took courage for him to say it, and because I had not raised him to be this person, and I could see that he knew that. Nathan and Simone moved out of my house in November. They found a rental apartment in Hamilton. It is not large, and it is not in a neighborhood Nathan had originally imagined for himself at this point in his life, and I think that is, for now, correct. Simone is in a formal debt repayment program with a licensed insolvency trustee. That is the Canadian term, and it is a real and regulated process with real protections. And from what Nathan tells me, she is taking it seriously. I moved back home the second week of November. The silver maple had lost most of its leaves. The front walk still has that lifted section from the roots, and I have still never once considered having the tree taken down. My first evening back, I made dinner for one and ate it at the kitchen table with the radio on and Gerald's photograph back on the hall table where it belongs. I called my sister in Halifax. I called Margaret and thanked her for the room and told her I owed her a visit in spring when her garden gets going. Then I sat in Gerald's chair and I looked at my living room, at the things I have accumulated in 31 years in this house, the small objects in the furniture and the afternoon light coming in the west window, the way it always does, and I felt something that is hard to name exactly. Not triumph, not relief entirely. Something more like recognition, like looking in a mirror and finding that the face looking back at you is still your own. I want to say something to anyone who is reading this, anyone who is in a situation that rhymes with mine, because I know I am not unusual. I know there are other women, other parents who have found themselves in a house that started feeling like it belonged to everyone else, who has been made to feel that needing the walls around them is somehow selfish, somehow an inconvenience to the people who were supposed to love them. You are not a resource. You are not a fallback plan. You are not someone else's balance sheet. The people who love you should know the difference between what is theirs and what is yours. And if they have forgotten, if the fog of their own trouble has made them forget, you are allowed to remind them. Quietly, clearly, without cruelty. but also without apology. Gerald used to say there's a difference between being patient and being invisible. He wasn't a man of many speeches, but that one I wrote down. I think about it still. Standing at my kitchen counter, mug in hand, the chip near the sink still there, the maple out front still lifting the walk, the photograph back where it belongs. Patience is a kind of love, but it is not the same as disappearing, and I am still here. I've been sitting with this for a while now, trying to find the right words for what I actually learned. Not the tidy version, not the version that makes me sound wiser than I was in the middle of it. What I keep coming back to is this: the way things ended wasn't an accident. It wasn't luck. It was the accumulation of every choice each of us made, quietly and consistently, over months. Cause and effect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just shows up one Monday morning in the form of a registered letter. Nathan made choices out of panic and, I think, out of a kind of love that had lost its compass. He loved Simone and he couldn't fix her situation through honest means, so he reached for something that wasn't his to reach for. That reaching had consequences, not because the universe punishes people, but because actions have weight and eventually that weight lands somewhere. It landed on him. Simone made choices too, years of them before I was ever part of the picture. Debt doesn't appear overnight. It builds in the quiet, in the small decisions that feel manageable until they aren't. I don't say that with judgment. I say it because I think she knew, somewhere, that what they were asking of me wasn't right. People usually know. They just hope no one will say it plainly. And I made choices. The choice to be quiet when I needed to think. The choice to call Robert and Patricia and Margaret instead of crying in my kitchen. The choice to understand my own legal standing before I said a single word. That wasn't cunning. It was just what Gerald always called finding the quiet spot, doing the thinking before the talking. I had spent 34 years teaching children that the most important things take patience and preparation. I should have remembered that applied to me too. What Nathan forgot for a while was something I had tried to teach him when he was small. That doing right by the people who love you isn't a burden. It's the foundation everything else is built on. When you treat someone's dignity as negotiable, the thing you're really eroding is your own character. He was a good man who got lost. I believe that. And I believe he found his way back not because things worked out legally, but because he was willing to sit across a kitchen table and say he was sorry without conditions. That took something real. It took the kind of honesty that doesn't come easily to people who've been wrong. I don't take that for granted. What I want anyone to take from this, anyone who recognizes something of themselves in my kitchen, in my chair, in that hollow feeling of being made to feel like an inconvenience in your own life, is that clarity is available to you. Not revenge, not bitterness. Clarity. The kind that comes when you stop waiting for someone else to acknowledge your worth and simply act as though it was never in question. You can be gentle and still be unmovable. You can love your children and still refuse to be consumed by their emergencies. You can walk out of a difficult situation not in defeat but in full possession of yourself. The silver maple is still lifting the front walk. I still haven't had it cut down. Some things are worth the inconvenience of their roots.